Imagine being a child and realizing your father loves you so much he could destroy your entire world for it. Mary Tudor, later known as Bloody Mary, wasn't born into a fairy tale of crowns and roses. She was born into a court of daggers, whispers, and a father whose obsession with love and legacy would tear her life apart before she was even grown. Her father was Henry VIII, the king who defied the Pope, broke England from Rome, and left a trail of wives, blood, and betrayal. But before all that, he was simply her father, a man who adored his little girl, dressed her in jewels, and called her his pearl of the kingdom. And yet, that same love would become the seed of her deepest trauma, because Henry's desperate need for a male heir would shatter Mary's childhood, strip her of her title, and leave her questioning her worth, her faith, and even her sanity. This is not just a royal story, it's the forbidden, heartbreaking truth of a princess raised in the shadow of deadly love. The bells of Greenwich rang in the cold February air of 1516, announcing the birth of a child who, for one shining moment, carried the hopes of an entire kingdom. The people of England rejoiced. Trumpets echoed through the streets. Courtiers feasted on roasted meats and rich wines, and prayers of gratitude rose from every church altar. Queen Catherine of Aragon had given birth to a living child after years of stillbirths and heartbreak. King Henry VIII, young, handsome, and burning with ambition, proudly announced to his court the arrival of his daughter, Mary. She was not the son Henry craved, but in those first moments, disappointment was swallowed by the joy of a healthy baby. Mary was his pearl, his jewel, the living proof that the Tudor dynasty still had God's blessing. From her earliest days, Mary was treated not as an ordinary child, but as a miniature queen. Her cradle was carved from gilded wood and lined with silks. Her clothes were fashioned from crimson velvet, cloth gold, and ermine. Pearls adorned her tiny headdresses, jewels sparkled at her wrists, and her shoes were sewn from the finest Spanish leather. Foreign ambassadors marveled at her beauty, at the sharpness of her gaze, at her remarkable calm. Henry adored her. He would carry her into the great halls, beaming with pride as he showed her off to envoys and nobles. "She never cries," he would boast, lifting her for all to see. "God has blessed me with a daughter wiser than any son." At banquets, he placed her on his knee, laughing as she played with the jeweled chains across his chest. When musicians performed, he clapped along with her small hands, declaring her England's brightest hope. Catherine of Aragon, deeply devout and fiercely protective, poured herself into Mary's upbringing. She taught her Latin, French, Spanish, music, and prayer. Mary was raised with the education of a prince, not merely how to sew or dance, but how to reason, debate, and command. Catherine knew her daughter's future depended on strength. Having endured humiliation and sorrow at Henry's court, Catherine intended that Mary would be unshakable. Molded in the image of her Spanish ancestors, Ferdinand and Isabella, monarchs who had united a kingdom for a while. Mary's childhood gleamed like a jewel in the crown of England. She was adored by her parents, admired by courtiers, and betrothed in whispers to princes across Europe. Some spoke of a French alliance, others of tying her to the Holy Roman Empire. Mary herself, still a child, laughed as she played her virginals, sang hymns in Latin, and danced at feasts. The palace seemed to hold nothing but light, But shadows were already lengthening. Henry's love for his daughter was real, but it was poisoned by his hunger for legacy. He had married Catherine for love and for alliance. But as the years dragged on and no son survived infancy, Henry's pride turned to frustration, and frustration to obsession. Mary was brilliant, gifted, beloved, but she was still only a girl. A girl could not inherit without risk. A girl could not secure the Tudor line with the same force as a boy. Each time Henry looked at Mary, he saw both his pride and his failure. Mary, though still young, sensed the change. She heard whispers in the corridors of Greenwich, servants murmuring about the king's dark moods, courtiers speaking cautiously of his need for a male heir. She saw the lines deepen in her mother's face as Catherine prayed longer each day, kneeling until her knees bled, begging God for a son. She noticed her father's smile falter, his laughter grow rare, his gaze drifting more often to other women at court. And then there was Anne Boleyn. The whispers of her name began softly, a murmur in the tapestries, the flicker of a candle in the dark. But soon they grew louder. Henry, once devoted to Catherine, now seemed entranced by this younger, vibrant woman. Mary watched the shift with a child's confusion. She did not yet understand adultery, or politics, or the dangerous currents of desire, but she felt the chill in the air when her father entered the room, the tension that thickened between her parents, the way courtiers' eyes darted nervously whenever Anne's name was spoken. Mary still adored her father. She would run to him, clutching at his robes, her face bright with joy. He would lift her, kiss her cheek, call her his pearl. But as soon as she was set down, the mask would slip, and Henry's eyes would harden with the weight of his longing for a son. That love, which had once seemed so pure, so radiant, was already twisting into something deadly, something that would tear Mary's world apart. The golden nursery became a place of dread. Mary heard the arguments late at night, her father's booming voice echoing through the corridors, her mother's desperate pleas swallowed in the darkness. She was told to pray, to obey, to trust in God's plan. But even as a child, she sensed that God's plan was cruel, and that her father's love, once her greatest treasure, was becoming her greatest curse. The princess, who had once been paraded like a jewel of England, was about to be shattered, piece by piece, by the very man who had called her his pearl. The palace halls that once rang with laughter began to echo with whispers of betrayal. Mary, still only a child, noticed the subtle changes before she fully understood them. Her mother's eyes, once full of quiet confidence, now seemed shadowed with sorrow. Her father's booming voice, which had always carried pride when he spoke of his pearl, grew sharp with impatience. The court no longer celebrated Mary as the jewel of England. Instead, murmurs filled the air, murmurs of a new woman, Anne Boleyn, and of a king who would defy heaven itself to have her. Mary adored her mother, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine had taught her to read Latin, to play music, to bow her head in reverence before God. She was a queen of unshakable dignity, a woman whose faith seemed carved from stone. To Mary, she was everything a mother should be: gentle, yet strong, sorrowful, yet steadfast. But Catherine's devotion to her daughter could not shield them from Henry's ambition. Henry was no longer content with a daughter. He demanded a son, an heir to secure the Tudor throne. The older Mary grew, the clearer this truth became. She was not enough. Her father's eyes no longer lit up with pride when he watched her play her virginals or speak flawless Latin to foreign envoys. Instead, his gaze turned cold, as if the very sight of her reminded him of his failure. And Anne Boleyn, with her sharp wit and dangerous charm, fanned the flames of his dissatisfaction. She whispered that his marriage to Catherine was cursed, invalid in God's eyes, and that Mary, his beloved child, was nothing more than a bastard born of sin. The walls of the palace seemed to close in around Mary as her father began his great rebellion against the Church of Rome. Priests who had once blessed her now looked away. Nobles who had once bowed before her now measured their loyalty by how they spoke of Anne. Mary, still only a teenager, watched as her father's love for her mother turned to cruelty, and with it, his affection for her began to unravel. The break was brutal. Henry demanded that Mary no longer call herself princess. She was stripped of her household, separated from her mother, and forced to serve in the household of her infant half-sister, Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. For a child raised in silks and honored as England's jewel, it was a humiliation designed to break her spirit. She was forbidden from seeing her mother, even as Catherine lay dying in lonely exile. Letters smuggled between them carried words soaked in sorrow, but they were all Mary had. When Catherine finally died in 1536, Mary was not even allowed to attend her funeral. The girl who had once been Henry's adored pearl was now treated as an outcast. Servants whispered bastard as she passed. Courtiers bowed to Elizabeth instead. Her father, the man who had once carried her on his knee before ambassadors, now refused to look her in the eye. The deadly love that had once defined her childhood had twisted into a weapon love that could raise her higher than the stars, and hate that could crush her deeper than the earth. And yet, Mary did not break. Her spirit, forged in the fire of her mother's teachings, held fast. She clung to her Catholic faith with unyielding devotion, kneeling in prayer long into the night, whispering to God in the language her mother had taught her. She refused to sign declarations naming her father's new marriage legitimate. She refused to call Elizabeth the true heir, even when threatened with imprisonment, even when her own life seemed to hang in the balance. Mary clung to her dignity. This defiance only deepened the wedge between her and her father. Henry raged at her stubbornness, declaring that she was a child of disobedience, unworthy of his name. But beneath his anger was a deeper truth. Mary was his daughter. She carried his fire, his pride, his unbending will. In defying him, she mirrored him, and perhaps that was why he could never fully destroy her. Anne Boleyn's fall brought Mary no peace. When the Queen was executed in 1536, her head severed on the Tower Green, Mary might have hoped for reconciliation, but Henry's love was too poisoned, too conditional. He married a Genjan Seymour and finally gained the son he had always desired, Edward. Mary was forced to bow to this new heir, her position further diminished. Yet still, she endured in the long shadows of the palace. Mary's childhood ended not with joy, but with betrayal. She had learned the cost of her father's deadly love. She had been raised as his pearl, only to be shattered by his ambition. And though she survived, though she kept her faith, the wounds he carved into her soul would never truly heal. Her childhood was over. What remained was a woman forged in pain, destined to one day become queen in her own right, tanned to rule not with tenderness, but with the same deadly fire that had once consumed her father. The years after her mother's death carved Mary Tudor into someone older than her age. She was still young, still a teenager, but she carried herself with the gravity of someone who had seen kingdoms rise and fall from within her own home. She had watched her father break from the Pope, crown himself supreme head of the Church of England, and discard wives like garments when they no longer pleased him. She had watched her mother die alone, abandoned her only comfort, the letters she and Mary exchanged in secret. And now, Mary carried the memory of Catherine of Aragon like a torch flick, fragile but unyielding at court. She lived in the long shadow of her half-brother, Edward, the son Henry finally secured with Jane Seymour. Jane was dead, but Edward was very much alive, the golden boy for whom Henry had nearly torn Christendom apart. Mary was forced to bow before him, to acknowledge him as the true heir. It burned her, but she endured, holding her composure with the regal grace her mother had taught her. Henry's affection returned in unpredictable flashes. Some days he called Mary to dine with him, laughing as though nothing had ever happened, as though she were still the little girl he had once lifted before foreign ambassadors. Other days he raged at her stubbornness, reminding her that she was lucky to even remain alive. His love was like a blade, one side gleaming, the other side ready to cut, and Mary, trapped in his court, never knew which edge she would face. Her faith was the anchor that steadied her. Each morning and night she whispered the prayers her mother had taught her. Each mass she secretly attended, each rosary bead she clutched, was an act of defiance against the new order her father had forced upon England. The break from Rome had shattered the country. Monasteries were dissolved, churches stripped bare, priests executed for refusing to acknowledge Henry's supremacy. To be Catholic in England was to risk everything, and Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, could never be anything else. Her devotion was both her strength and her danger. Courtiers whispered about her in the shadows, calling her proud, obstinate, even dangerous. Yet there were others who admired her courage, who saw in her the last living link to the old faith. To them, she was not just Mary, she was hope. She was the promise that one day England might return to the true church. And so, even as she was kept under watch, she became a symbol, a figure whispered about in villages and noble houses alike. But Mary herself was caught between two worlds. She longed for the warmth of her father's love, yet she could never accept the price of his approval. To embrace him fully meant betraying her mother, betraying her faith, betraying herself. So she stood at a distance, bowed when she had to, obeyed when her survival depended on it, but in her heart she remained unbroken. The court was a dangerous place for someone like Mary. Every glance was a test, every word a trap. Spies listened at doors, courtiers carried tales back to the king, and Anne Boleyn's allies' affidins, executions still whispered poison about Catherine's daughter. Mary learned to mask her emotions, to school her face into calm, but inside, her heart burned with grief and fury. One night, lying awake in her chamber, she remembered her childhood, the warmth of her father's arms, the sound of her mother's laughter, the golden light of her early years. It felt like another lifetime, a story belonging to someone else. She realized then that she was no longer the adored pearl of her father's eye. She was a survivor in a court of daggers, and survival meant sacrifice. When Henry demanded that she finally acknowledge his supremacy over the church and the legitimacy of his marriage to Anne, Mary resisted until the very edge of ruin. Threats of imprisonment, whispers of execution loomed over her. She was barely 17, yet already facing the fate of traitors. In the end, under immense pressure, she signed the documents that named her a bastard and acknowledged her father's supremacy. It broke her spirit for a time, but it saved her life. Even then, the courtiers saw something chilling in her defiance. For though she bent, she did not break. Though she signed, she never believed. In her heart, she remained Catherine's daughter, the true princess of England, and a woman whose time would one day come. Her father's deadly love had stripped her of her title, her dignity, her childhood, but it had also given her something he could never have foreseen: the steel of survival, the fire of defiance, the unshakable will of a queen in waiting. The years that followed turned Mary Tudor from a child of sorrow into a woman of quiet, unshakable resilience. She was no longer the little girl who ran laughing to her father's arms, nor the teenager trembling under the weight of betrayal. By her 20s, she had become something different, a living contradiction in Henry VIII's England, both a daughter and an enemy, both cherished blood and dangerous rival. The court shifted like quicksand beneath her feet. Queens came and went in rapid succession. Anne Boleyn executed, Jane Seymour dead in childbirth, Anne of Cleves dismissed in a humiliating annulment, Catherine Howard condemned to the block. Each time, Mary watched with a strange mixture of pity and dread. She knew better than anyone the cost of being loved by Henry VIII. His affection could crown you queen, but it could, just as easily, destroy you. And yet, Mary's own relationship with her father never severed entirely. There were moments, fleeting, fragile, when he showed glimpses of the man who had once adored her. At court dinners, he sometimes called her forward, praising her accomplishments in music or language. On rare days, he spoke of her beauty, her intelligence, her grace. For those brief moments, Mary felt the warmth of the father she had loved as a child, but the warmth always burned away, leaving only the cold shadow of his demands. Henry's new queen, Catherine Parr, brought some measure of peace. Unlike her predecessors, Catherine was learned, compassionate, and politically astute. She worked to reconcile Henry with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, lobbying to restore them to the line of succession. For the first time in years, Mary was treated with a measure of dignity. She dined openly at court, her title of princess whispered once more, even if not formally restored. But the damage of her childhood lingered. Every smile her father offered, every gesture of kindness, was poisoned by the memory of what he had taken. She remembered her mother's exile, her mother's death, the humiliation of serving Elizabeth, the sting of signing papers that denied her legitimacy. Mary never truly forgave. She carried the wounds in silence, her faith the only balm for her soul. Her Catholic devotion deepened as the years wore on. Each rosary bead she touched, each mass she heard in secret, bound her more firmly to the memory of her mother. To Mary, Catherine of Aragon was not just her mother, she was her saint, her model of endurance. And so Mary endured, waiting in shadows, biding her time. In these years, whispers of rebellion swirled around her. Many in England still clung to the old faith, resentful of Henry's break from Rome. Horrified by the dissolution of monasteries, the execution of priests, the stripping of sacred altars, to them, Mary was not simply a discarded princess. She was hope itself, a symbol that one day England might return to the true church. Men and women spoke her name in secret, praying that she would one day rule. Mary, cautious and watchful, never openly rebelled. She understood the danger too well. But in her very existence, she was a threat. Every time she knelt in prayer, every time she refused to embrace the new order, she reminded England that the old ways were not dead. She was a flame kept alive in the darkness, small but steady, waiting for the wind to carry it further. Her father, aging and increasingly tyrannical, saw this. He could never quite extinguish his daughter's spirit. He raged at her stubbornness, but he never dared to end her life. Perhaps, deep down, some remnant of his old love still protected her, or perhaps he feared the backlash her death would spark. Whatever the reason, Mary survived where so many others perished as Henry's health declined. The palace grew darker, its halls filled with tension and fear. The once vibrant king was now swollen, sickly, prone to violent outbursts. Mary saw in him the ruin of the man she had once adored. She visited when required, bowing, speaking softly, concealing the storm within her. To others, she appeared calm, dutiful, resigned. But inside, she carried both rage and sorrow, a child's grief, twisted into a woman's determination. When Henry finally died in 1547, Mary wept, not because she had lost a kind father, but because she had lost the man who had once been her entire world. His love had shaped her, scarred her, and haunted her. He had been her protector and her destroyer, her king and her curse. His death marked the end of her childhood at last, and yet, even in death, Henry's presence loomed over her. His son, Edward VI, now reigned, a boy king raised in Protestant faith. Mary's Catholic devotion placed her in immediate danger once more. The deadly love of her father had ended, but its consequences were far from over. His ambition had left England divided. His choices had branded Mary an enemy in her own land, and his shadow would follow her to her dying breath. The child who had once been England's pearl had grown into a woman of fire and steel. She had survived betrayal, humiliation, and exile. But survival was not enough. Her destiny was still waiting, written in blood, waiting for the day she would claim it. The death of Henry VIII did not free Mary from his shadow, it only deepened it. The court, once dominated by his towering presence, now bowed to a boy, Edward VI, barely 9 years old. Yet it was not Edward who held power, but the Protestant regents who guided him. Men determined to erase every trace of the old faith. For Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, it meant stepping directly from one prison into another. Her childhood was over, yet the wounds of it lingered in every breath she took. She remembered the laughter of her father when she was little, the warmth of his arms when he called her his pearl. She remembered the anguish of being cast aside, stripped of her title, called bastard in the halls where she had once been celebrated. She remembered the hollow ache of losing her mother, denied even the comfort of a final embrace. And now, in her 20s, she carried all of it with her, like a second skin trauma woven into her bones, shaping every step, every choice, every prayer. The regents who ruled in Edward's name demanded that Mary conform. They pressed her to abandon the Catholic Mass, to accept the Protestant reforms that were sweeping across England. They warned her, threatened her, even plotted against her. But Mary's defiance, born in the crucible of her father's deadly love, had hardened into steel. She had bent once before, as a teenager, signing away her legitimacy to survive. She would not bend again. Not now, not ever. Every morning, she rose before dawn and prayed the rosary her mother had once pressed into her hands. Every day, she insisted on hearing Mass in her private chambers, even when it was forbidden. Servants carried tales of her defiance, but Mary did not care. To her, these rituals were more than faith. They were survival, rebellion, and identity. She was not only Mary Tudor, she was Catherine's daughter. She was the living memory of the Queen Henry could not erase. The people saw this. Across the countryside, whispers spread. Mary remained true. While priests were executed, altars destroyed, and churches stripped bare, the king's eldest daughter clung to the old ways. In her, Catholics found a beacon of hope, a flickering light that refused to go out. They spoke her name in secret prayers, imagining the day she might ascend the throne and restore what had been lost. Mary knew the danger of their hope. She had lived too long in the web of her father's ambition not to see the traps waiting for her. But even so, she carried herself with dignity, her chin high, her back straight, her eyes unwavering. She had learned in childhood to hide her fear, to mask her pain, to speak carefully while her heart blazed in silence. She had learned that survival was not weakness, but strategy. The scars of her childhood shaped every part of her. Where other women her age dreamed of love, Mary mistrusted it. Her father's love had been a weapon, her mother's love a wound. Where others longed for marriage, Mary saw chains. Where others saw faith as ritual, she saw it as her lifeline, the one inheritance no one could strip from her. And so Mary grew into a woman both feared and admired. To her enemies, she was a stubborn relic of a dying faith. To her supporters, she was a heroine waiting for her crown. To herself, she was still the child who had once been lifted proudly by her father, only to be dropped into the fire of betrayal. The memory of that betrayal never left her. It burned in her heart, forging her into something unyielding. Years later, when she finally became queen, the world would know her as Bloody Mary, a ruler who unleashed flames upon England in her determination to restore the Catholic faith. But beneath the name, beneath the legend, lay this truth. She was a woman shaped by a father's deadly love, a child torn between devotion and destruction. Every fire she lit as queen was fueled by the ashes of her childhood. Her story did not end in childhood, but childhood never left her. It haunted her, defined her, became the ghost behind every decision she made. And perhaps that is the true tragedy of Mary Tudor, that the girl who had once been England's pearl, adored by her father, never fully escaped the scars he carved into her soul.